Steve McQueen was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. He drove race cars, flew planes, rode motorcycles, and made the whole world want to be him. And yet, once a week, he drove to a quiet house in Los Angeles, knocked on the door, and waited to be taught by a man who couldn't get a leading role in any of the films that McQueen starred in. This is the story of one of the most unlikely friendships in the history of Hollywood, and what it tells us about the kind of man Bruce Lee actually was behind the legend. To understand why Steve McQueen sought out Bruce Lee, you first have to understand who Steve McQueen was in the late 1960s, not the icon, the actual man. McQueen had grown up poor, in and out of reform schools, largely without a father. He'd scraped his way into acting through sheer force of will and a physical presence that the camera found irresistible. And by the late 1960s, he'd become something that the film industry produced very rarely, a genuine movie star in the old sense, the kind of person whose name on a poster guaranteed an audience, whose physical presence on screen created a specific and irreplaceable electricity. Bullet, The Great Escape, The Thomas Crown Affair. These were not just successful films, they were McQueen films, and the difference mattered. People went to see him, not the story, not the director, not the studio, him. He was 38 years old in 1968, earning more money per film than almost anyone in the industry, and he was deeply, genuinely restless. Fame had not settled him. Success had not resolved the thing in him that was always scanning the horizon for the next challenge. He had a temper, he had a competitive streak that people who worked with him described as almost pathological, a need to be the best at whatever was being done, in whatever room he happened to be in. And yet McQueen was never comfortable inside that fame. He was drawn to physical challenges that most men of his wealth and status would have sensibly avoided. He raced cars seriously, at a level where the risk of death was not hypothetical. He was interested in fighting, not as performance, not as movie choreography, but as a real physical skill that he wanted to actually possess. It was this combination, the restlessness, the competitiveness, and the genuine appetite for real skill that led to Bruce Lee. The two men first met in 1966 through the network of martial arts enthusiasts that had begun to form around Bruce's growing reputation in Los Angeles. Bruce had been teaching Kung Fu to a select group of private students since the early 1960s, and by the mid-1960s, his reputation had spread well beyond the martial arts community. The people who trained with him talked about the experience in terms that were difficult to account for through conventional description. It wasn't just that he was fast, or that his technique was precise, or that his physical ability was outside the normal range. It was that training with Bruce Lee changed the way you thought about your own body, about what it was capable of, about what you had been doing wrong, about how much of what you thought you knew about physical performance was mythology rather than reality. McQueen was introduced to Bruce through Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairstylist who had been one of the first people to recognize Bruce's potential for the entertainment industry and had facilitated his meeting with producer William Dozier, the meeting that led to the Green Hornet. Sebring himself was a student of Bruce's and spoke about the experience with a conviction that caught McQueen's attention. McQueen was not a man who was easily impressed by other people's descriptions of extraordinary abilities. He needed to see things for himself. He arranged a meeting.
What happened at that meeting is not recorded in detail, but the outcome is not in doubt. McQueen became a student. He committed to regular private lessons, paid generously, and showed up consistently, which was, for a man of McQueen's fame and schedule, a significant statement about how seriously he took what he was learning. The lessons were held at Bruce's home, and the dynamic between the two men was, by all accounts, genuinely unusual. McQueen was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. Bruce Lee was at this point a man whose television career had stalled after the Green Hornet's cancellation and who was struggling to find his next foothold in the industry. In any other context, the power differential would have been absolute. In Bruce's training space, it was completely reversed. McQueen took instructions. McQueen made mistakes. McQueen had to be corrected repeatedly on the same movements, while the man correcting him performed those movements with a precision and speed that made McQueen's best efforts look elementary. Students who witnessed sessions between the two men described something that was unusual to observe. A man of McQueen's stature being genuinely humbled, not in a degrading way, but in the way that real learning requires. Bruce did not soften his corrections for famous students. He did not modulate his directness based on how much a client was paying or who they were outside the training room. If the technique was wrong, he said it was wrong. If the footwork was sloppy, he demonstrated the difference between sloppy and correct with a movement so fluid that it barely seemed to occupy the same physical reality as what the student had just attempted. He was not cruel about this. He was simply honest, in a way that most people in McQueen's world had stopped being with him years earlier. By all accounts, McQueen was fine with this. More than fine, he responded to it. He had spent years surrounded by people who deferred to him, who told him what he wanted to hear, who shaped themselves around his preferences and his moods. Bruce Lee did none of these things. He was direct, exacting, and entirely unimpressed with celebrity. He cared about whether the technique was correct. He cared about whether the student was genuinely learning. Whether the student was famous had nothing to do with either of those things. This quality, the complete absence of sycophancy, the willingness to tell the most powerful man in the room that he was doing it wrong, was, according to people who knew both men, one of the things McQueen valued most. It was rare in his world. It was, in some ways, the thing he most needed from the people around him and almost never got. What Bruce taught McQueen was not simply a set of physical techniques. He taught him Jeet Kune Do, the philosophy of combat that Bruce had been developing for years, which was built around the idea that the most effective way to fight was to be completely present and completely adaptable, with no fixed style and no habitual patterns that an opponent could read and predict. This was an idea that resonated with McQueen on levels beyond the physical. His entire career had been built on a version of the same principle, the refusal to be predictable, the insistence on finding the real thing beneath the performed version. He recognized in Bruce's philosophy something that mapped onto his own deepest instincts about what made a performance true. The lessons continued for several years. During this time, the two men developed a friendship that went beyond the student-teacher relationship. They spent time together outside the training sessions. McQueen and his wife Neil socialized with Bruce and Linda. McQueen became genuinely invested in Bruce's career, not just as a student who appreciated his teacher, but as someone who understood with increasing frustration that the industry he was part of was failing to recognize something extraordinary.
McQueen was not subtle about his opinion of Bruce Lee. He told people directly, in terms that left no room for ambiguity, that Bruce Lee was the most physically gifted human being he had ever encountered. He said this in a context where he had encountered a great many physically gifted human beings, stuntmen, athletes, fighters, soldiers. The statement was not casual. It was a considered assessment from someone who had spent years testing his own physical limits and understood with genuine precision what it meant to operate at the outer edge of human capability. And yet, the phone calls McQueen made on Bruce's behalf, the conversations he had with studio executives about the potential of an Asian leading man, the influence he tried to bring to bear on the people who controlled what got made and who got cast, none of it moved the needle. The studios were polite, they were respectful of McQueen's opinion, and then they cast someone else.
James Coburn, who was simultaneously one of Bruce's closest students and one of his closest friends, experienced the same frustration from a different angle. Coburn had been drawn to Bruce even earlier than McQueen. The two men met in the early 1960s, before the Green Hornet, when Bruce was teaching in Los Angeles, and Coburn was a rising actor looking for something beyond the conventional action hero persona that the industry was trying to build around him. Bruce gave him that. Their relationship was, from the beginning, more collaborative than instructional. Two men with genuinely compatible intellectual temperaments, both interested in the philosophical dimensions of physical practice, both resistant to the simplified versions of themselves that their respective industries were trying to construct. Coburn co-developed the concept for The Silent Flute with Bruce, a film that was intended to be a serious, philosophically ambitious martial arts story that would showcase both Bruce's physical ability and his intellectual depth. The two men traveled to India together in 1971 to scout locations, spending weeks moving through the country looking for landscapes that matched the vision they had developed together. They talked constantly about philosophy, about the nature of physical movement, about what martial arts meant as a way of understanding the world rather than simply as a way of fighting. People who saw them together during that trip described a creative partnership between two men who had found in each other someone capable of matching their respective intensities. The project fell apart when studio financing collapsed. The Silent Flute was eventually made after Bruce's death, with David Carradine in the role that had been written for Bruce, under the title Circle of Iron. Coburn refused to be involved. He had no interest in watching someone else embody a vision that had been built around and with and for Bruce Lee. He said in the years afterward that the failure to make The Silent Flute with Bruce was one of the great professional regrets of his life, not because of what it would have meant for his own career, but because he had watched Bruce pour so much of himself into that project, and the world never got to see what it would have been. When Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973, Steve McQueen was one of the pallbearers at his funeral in Seattle. He stood at the graveside of a man he had known for 7 years and carried his coffin on his shoulder alongside James Coburn, Chuck Norris, and a small group of others who had been genuinely close to Bruce. The ceremony was private, attended by family and the people who knew the real man rather than the emerging myth. McQueen, who had spent his career projecting an image of absolute self-possession, the man who was cool under pressure, the man who could outrun anything, the man who feared nothing, was visibly devastated. People who were present at the funeral described him as shaken in a way they had not seen before and would not see again.
He spoke about Bruce in interviews in the years that followed, carefully, without sensationalism, in the measured way of someone who understood that the person being discussed was beyond the reach of easy description. He said that Bruce had been one of the most important people in his life. He said that training with Bruce had changed how he thought about his own physical existence in ways that had stayed with him permanently. He said in one interview that has been quoted many times since that Bruce Lee was the one man he was genuinely uncertain he could have handled in a real physical confrontation, and McQueen, who had never been uncertain about his ability to handle anyone, meant it as the highest possible compliment. The story of Steve McQueen and Bruce Lee is, at its core, a story about what happens when two genuinely extraordinary people find each other across the barriers that should have kept them apart. The barrier of fame, of money, of racial hierarchy, of the industry's determination to keep Bruce Lee in a smaller box than the one he deserved. They found each other anyway. They built something real, and when it ended, the man who had everything that Hollywood could give was the one standing at a graveside, carrying the weight of a loss that the people who had refused to take Bruce seriously would spend decades failing to understand. It is worth dwelling on what that image means. The most powerful actor in Hollywood, standing in a Seattle cemetery, carrying the coffin of a man whom that same Hollywood had systematically excluded. McQueen knew what Bruce was, He had known for years, and so had Coburn and Kareem and everyone else who had spent time in Bruce's training room and walked away changed. The knowledge was available to anyone who spent 30 minutes watching Bruce Lee move. The studios simply chose, for years, not to look. McQueen lived until 1980, dying of cancer at the age of 50. He never stopped speaking about Bruce in the years between the funeral and his own death. He said in one of his last interviews that the most important lessons of his life had come from unexpected places, and that the most unexpected of all had been a quiet house in Los Angeles, where a man smaller than him had spent years teaching him things about his own body and his own mind that nobody else had ever come close to showing him. Bruce Lee once said, "Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do." Steve McQueen understood this better than most. He had watched the man say it and then demonstrate exactly what it meant week after week in that quiet house in Los Angeles while Hollywood looked the other way. The studios eventually came around, after Bruce was gone, after Enter the Dragon made the whole argument for him in a language that even the most resistant executive could not pretend not to understand. But McQueen didn't need Enter the Dragon to tell him who Bruce Lee was. He had known for years. He had been carrying that knowledge, and eventually that coffin, and finally that grief. Some people in Hollywood never got to understand what they had overlooked. Steve McQueen was not one of those people. He understood completely, and it cost him something every time he thought about it for the rest of his life. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Have you ever had a mentor who changed the way you saw the world? Leave your answer in the comments and share this video with someone who needs to hear about the friendship that Hollywood never deserved to witness.